夢を束ねて波動を志す。その意気込みは褒めてやる。だが強者どもわきまえていたか。夢とはやがてことごとく冷めて消えるのが道理だと。
If there is a word spoken an obscene amount of times on the main entries of the Fate franchise, it would be some variation of ideal. An ideal is described as this thing that is perfect, a principle to aim for, or some definitions describe an ideal as something that can only exist within one's imagination, unlikely to come into reality. Essentially, an ideal is antithetical to what is real. Fate is a series whose characters struggle with achieving an ideal. Ideals of being a hero that saves everyone, ideals of erasing mistakes of the past, or ideals of world domination. This journey of characters pursuing their goal is intertwined with the pursuit of the Holy Grail, something that the characters believe will make their ideal come true, or be a means to help make it come true. The Holy Grail acts as a symbol to achieve the impossible, only for it to be revealed that it is not indeed that idyllic accomplishment everyone so wants it to be. Something that cannot grant something that can't be achieved by the wisher, and an object corrupted with all of the world's evil. I don't know about you, but I think nothing tells you that your ideal is a pipe dream more than the only thing in the world being described as an all-wish granting magical object that gives form to the impossible is just a sham. This narrative decision in itself raises a question. If this goal cannot be fulfilled, what is the point? Well, Fate Zero also accentuates the importance of not only what ideal the characters are trying to reach, but the means of how they go about it. The ideals of the characters of Fate Zero try to achieve are on a spectrum of self-destructive for the sake of others to self-indulgent regardless of anyone else. This dichotomy of characters such as Kiritsugu, Saber, and Kirei, as he initially is, versus characters such as Gilgamesh, Rider, Ryunosuke, and Castor is an important one as it raises another question. Do these ideals, or the pursuit of these ideals, grant self-contentment? Lancer is a man who just wants self-satisfaction by abiding by the code of honor he believes in, that he felt like he couldn't while he was alive. Or on the extreme of the pursuit of pleasure is the wacky comedy duo of Ryunosuke and Castor, who just really like killing women and children, amongst other implied things I would rather not say. Despite how messed up these two are, they know what makes them happy and pursue it wholeheartedly. In a strange, twisted way, they end up being the happiest at their death compared to the others. Then look at Gilgamesh, a person who, being described as hedonist, would make the Guinness World Record for the biggest understatement of all time. He's a man who knows how to pleasure himself with wine, looking in the mirror and telling himself how sexy he is, and whatever whim strikes him at the moment. Gilgamesh is the foil to the cast of Fate Zero, as he comes into conflict with every character because of how much he puts himself first. He acts like a bemused observer as he feels the conflict is below him and unnecessary to him personally, which results in him making observations and pushing people around because it's fun, and hell, watching him do it is fun too. He tells Kirei to find what makes him happy and tries to get Saber to marry him, tempting her with every pleasure any person could ever want. Unlike every other character, Gilgamesh doesn't seek the Grail because in his head it already belongs to him, because he's a nut. This leaves him some time to observe and comment upon what he believes are the foolish ideals of all the other characters. This is a dude who in his mind has accomplished everything he could hope to accomplish, and instead spends his days basking in pleasure, and that's what this Grail War is to him. like when he abandons his master all because he was too boring for him. Rider is somewhat similar, even if he is framed nowhere near as dark and oppressive as good old Gilgi, even though their views come off as extreme. Gilgamesh and Rider do kind of get it, I guess. Rider, or Iskander, is a conqueror who has traveled the world and seeks out all sorts of pleasures, even in the unfamiliar modern world, as he goes out of his way to become a gamer. It makes him the perfect foil to Wet Blanket Waver, a young man who has no idea what his life should amount to, or what to really do with it besides trying to prove himself in the eyes of his peers, which Iskander regards as narrow-minded and constantly urges Waver to expand his horizons, with a little flick to the head to accompany it. Rider genuinely values companionship and finds value in allies more than enemies, as he's constantly trying to recruit the other servants. He wants to conquer without humiliating others, which shows his way of conquering is kind of just a way to expand his horizons and indulge himself in anything he can, by obtaining new allies and such. Waver observed that Iskander's conquest isn't in the material like lands or wealth or sick-ass gaming setup, but in people's hearts. Rider's personal philosophy is directly antithetical to Saber, a king who lives specifically as a tool for a country. When Rider clowns on her for their difference in the way they view kingship, he's not doing it to look down on Saber. He's genuinely upset that Saber doesn't prioritize herself, or is even given a chance to. Saber has no sense of self-worth other than her devotion to her kingdom, mechanically acting as its servant. When Saber says that she would just die for her ideals, Rider says that's not how a person should live. Rider tells Saber that she should wake up from this sad dream, or she will lose the modicum of pride she has as a heroic spirit, which is exactly how her arc ends in Fate Zero. Saber in Zero is chivalrous and honorable and still has pride as a knight and believes in honor and fighting before having it all, BAM, slapped away by the end, when she sees the tortured spirit of her old friend Lancelot. Like Rider said, the last of her self-worth and pride crumbles away as she sees how her method of rule has left the knight broken. Everything Rider preaches to Saber is to not regret her past and accept complete pride in how she ruled as a king, to not slowly spiral down into despair as she chases an impossible dream that gives her no personal pleasure. Because she doesn't give it up by the time she fights Lancelot, it all changes her for the worse, becoming desperate to obtain it. Gilgamesh tells her by the end that she has the face of a ravenous wild dog, because of her devotion to her kingdom as a mostly emotionless machine. She had no need to consider her own emotions, but the tragedy of this is because of her own rejection of self. She ultimately wasn't able to understand the others around her, as she felt no personal anger towards Lancelot towards his crimes, despite that being what he wanted. She acts as a foil to Rider in this way, as Rider's pleasure in being king is in making connections with others, whereas the way Saber leaves her unable to connect with anyone. She laments her inability to understand others, as by the end of Zero she comes to the conclusion that she should not have become king at all. As we see in Stay Night, her wish changes from a goal of stopping her kingdom from dying out to preventing her from becoming king in the first place, as she believes she is responsible for its destruction. Even though Lancelot tells her that everyone who followed her truly thought she was the best, Saber does not heed his or Rider's words. Not only is Saber's arc in Zero a perfect lead-in to her arc in Fate Stay Night, but it is important to the story of Zero as it illustrates the tragedy of someone that doesn't spare a thought for herself. Anyways, Karya enters the war to get some MILF pussy. Wait, no, I'm joking. Well, kinda. Karya is the most sympathetic at the start of Zero. As we know, he left the Mato family because of the freak immoral bug shit they got going on, and enters the war to save Sakura. But there are little details that paint a more complicated picture of the man. Kariya has a weird hyperfixation of fighting Tokiomi, even beyond the anger of him selling his daughter. He frames his motivation as trying to save Sakura and make Aoi happy, but constantly overlooks her feelings by trying his darndest to get rid of Tokiomi, which, if he could, he'd be like, "Hey baby, how's about you get with this nasty decrepit insect body?" When Aoi completely rejects him, he unlocks incel mode and chokes her to near death. Kariya couldn't really accept the complicated reality of the situation and takes out his frustration of not being able to get with the woman he loved. His dream of cucking Tokiomi and starting a family with Aoi and her daughters is one that does more harm to anyone than good, as it ignores the reality of what it would do to Kariya physically and mentally, and how Aoi and her children would feel about it. Kariya is an example of the very complicated but human pursuit of dreams. It's tragic because Kariya is genuinely a good dude, shown by having his reason he left the Mato family because of the icky, sticky bug magic they got going on. His goal of saving Sakura is sympathetic and mostly legit. The agony he receives from trying to achieve this altruistic goal ends up breaking him down and revealing deeper feelings that intertwine with his motivation to save Sakura. Then there's Kirei, who is a complicated person to say the least. Kirei is first presented as this man with dead-looking eyes, and he's being spun around by his father and Tokiomi, as shown visually. Someone who is born with the pleasure of bringing pain to others, but with the self-awareness to not chase those pleasures. A man who exists solely to serve the church as he abides by what is believed to be right in this world. Ideally, Kirei wants to be a normal person, with traditional pleasures, but really he is screwed up and likes making people miserable. When we see him, he is a man who does his best to mold himself into a normal person, like a son following the career path that would make his father proud. Good old Gilgi sees into Kirei and pushes him to pursue whatever gives him pleasure. When Gilgamesh asks him to give him a full rundown of his intel on the other masters, he noticed that Kirei spends more focus on Kariya, pushing him into pursuing his interest in him. Kariya is the one going through it the most and has seemingly the most altruistic means. So Kirei enjoys breaking down Kariya's good nature to his base selfish emotions, as he nearly kills Aoi in rage, and as he watches, Kirei enjoys drinking wine for the first time. Kirei is a fascinating character to watch, but a little bit tragic, as he is a man who has tried all his life to be normal, but just couldn't do it. He was broken by the time he was born and couldn't remedy this as much as he tried. By the end, Kirei accepts this twisted joy of bringing out pain in other people. Kirei is interesting because, hey, what do you do when the only thing that brings you happiness is others' unhappiness? Kirei's character is a brilliant twisted way to dovetail with this theme of pursuing pleasure, as even though he contrasts most of the cast, well, look how happy he is when he acts the truest to himself. Like, damn, he gave her the dagger he used to kill her dad with. Damn, that's gangster. For me, the core of what Fate Zero is all about is intertwined with its main protagonist, Emiya Kiritsugu. He is a man who embodies a ton of self-destructive behaviors in order to accomplish his goal. He's a man filled with tons of self-loathing, as he does tons of things in order to break down himself. He smokes, and whenever he eats, it's shitty fast food. His first scene is him lamenting how he doesn't deserve to feel the beauty of the love of a newborn daughter and his family. Like he has an affair with Maya, which is done purely as a self-destructive behavior. He is a man that was exposed to the darkness and tragedy of life and chose to accept it and forcibly form it into his philosophy. Huddersfield describes him as someone who finds happiness painful, so he does leaps and bounds to try and avoid it through his lifestyle. When he runs away from Shirley instead of killing her like she asked, in his mind, this leads to a ripple effect where the entire island gets killed. Before his voice even drops, he was confronted with a situation where he was unknowingly faced with a decision to either kill the girl he has a crush on or result in the death of an island's worth of people. This decision to run away from killing Shirley is something that traumatizes him, even though it's not really something he should feel guilty about. A pang of guilt that puts him on an unfortunate trajectory by killing his own father, so nothing like this can happen again. This trajectory continues as he discovers more of the tragedy of the world through his silly little adventures as a Magus killer, and ends up developing a cold, utilitarian ideology. The tragedy of this pursuit to make the world a better place is his methods, or they are contrary to the kind of person that Kiritsugu Emiya really is. The final scene of Zero gives us the context of Kiritsugu's motivations. A kid who promised that one day he would be a hero. The goal is still somewhat the same, to create a better world, but it's through a cynical approach that betrays the idealistic and loving person Kiritsugu is really.
ケリーはさ、どんな大人になりたいの?
We see glimmers of it through interactions with Iliasfield, playing together in the snowy field, the warmth in his voice and smile as he talks to her, and Irisfield's stories of him teaching her of the world so she can live a fulfilling life despite being born for the sole goal of being a sacrifice. But then he indulges in smoking, cold pragmatism, and killing, as these are all ways of him trying to kill the hero in him, while trying to fulfill the dream of a hero. To me, this tale centered around heroism feels like a vehicle to tell this tale about the struggle of happiness with reality. To get the full picture of what Zero is expressing, you need to take a closer look at Ryder and Waver to understand. It is telling that Ryder's wish isn't to be handed his goal he is striving for, but to get incarnation, a means to help him achieve the goal. Ryder knows his goal isn't achievable, so he focuses more on the journey and the happiness that pursuing the goal gives him. This is a sentiment that Ryder imparts to his master Waver, a young man who tunnel-visioned on academic success with no real-life experience with what makes him happy or not. Through his connection with the open-minded and open-hearted Ryder, he works his way out of his comfort zone. Waver needs acknowledgement, respect, and connection by trying to prove himself by winning the Holy Grail War, and Ryder is able to give him all of those things without him ever actually reaching the goal he thought would make all those things possible. Waver's experience with Ryder helps him understand that the goal was never really what mattered, but him going out of his way to try and achieve it is what opened him up to new experiences and helped him form a new perspective. Waver's kidnapped grandpa expresses to Waver that even though he manipulated him and his wife, just him being around them is valuable and gave them happiness without him ever really doing anything for them. Even says after you look back on a long life, there's nothing really worth risking your life over. There's no need to risk your own life over glory or whatnot, but to live a life to the fullest as you can, trying out new things. The last we see of Waver is a young man with a long life ahead of him, putting his studies aside to pursue just whatever, and starting by trying out the video games he thought were so useless. Sentiments expressed by Ryder in his final moments, that the beating of his heart was Okeanis all along. His lively, adventurous spirit that chased after Okeanis was what mattered, even though he would never reach it. Even Caster says all things formed are fated to break one day, so creators should find joy in the act of creation itself. These viewpoints put into context where Kiritsugu went awry. Kiritsugu once held a naive ideal of being a hero, but destroyed that in order to become a machine, in order to fulfill his mission of what he thought would be the best for humanity. But this was a failure from the outset, as there would be no way to achieve this other than the magic wish granting Holy Grail. with the context of Ryder and Waver's story, I think Zero shows us that even if Kiritsugu would have failed anyways, like Ryder to achieve his dream, wouldn't it have been better for him to do it in a way that was true to himself, in a way that made him self-content and maybe even happy? Fate Zero and subsequently Fate's Day Night is a story about the struggle between the ideal and the real, but I think at its core is a story about people who need to learn to prioritize themselves and their own happiness, to strike a reconciliation between what is ideal for their characters and the reality of it all in order to achieve this happiness. Ryder is the biggest example of this, as his idealistic dream of Okeanos was a lofty one, to put it lightly. But as he says in his final moments, it was the beating of his heart that was Okeanos all along. Deep down, he knew it was unattainable, but he didn't care because pursuing it is what was truest to himself and what made him happy. It's not the end goal, it's the journey that matters, as cliche of my way of putting it sounds compared to Fate Zero's creative way of putting it. Ryder strikes this compromise between the ideal and the real and dies contentedly because he lived for himself. This ties into the rest of the cast, as characters like Kiritsugu, Saber, and Kirei are miserable when they are not pursuing something that prioritizes themselves. Kiritsugu and Saber don't fulfill their goals, and more than that, the story does as much as it can to communicate that their goals were impossible from the outset. In this universe, the thing that is closest to symbolizing God and the Holy Grail is something corrupted, something that can't grant wishes without using realistic methods. That's just how harsh reality is in this world. This message doesn't necessarily come off as idyllic, but instead I think it's empathetic, as it more than anything promotes people to prioritize their happiness in this complicated, harsh world, which makes it all the more profound and personal. I've heard sentiments here and there from people that the characters in Fate Zero are mouthpieces and vehicles to get across ideologies. In reality, it's the exact opposite. The way characters cling to ideologies tells us so much about them, and how they treat themselves, and how they approach life itself. Fate Zero is not just a tale about ideologies, it's a tale about people and their struggles with happiness. Zero's ending is perfect. It's a sobering slap of reality, as it presents a sort of anti-climax in the sense that none of the characters really achieve what they initially set out to do, and the antagonists don't get their typical Hollywood ending comeuppance. But it's what the characters do with that reality that is profound and makes Zero unique. Kiritsugu spent a large portion of his life depressed and self-destructive, but by the end of the series we see a man who is saved, as he saves someone directly for the first time ever, something that puts him on a trajectory to spend his last several years with his adopted son being childish, prioritizing his happiness, goofing around as told by Shiro in the Fate's Day Night VN, but also passing on that naive idealism to his son. Waver gains an open mind with a long future ahead of him. The sky opens up for Saber in the end, as we know she will get another chance, not to obtain the Holy Grail, but to find happiness and identity beyond being an emotionless sword for the long-gone country she served. On his deathbed, Kiritsugu remembers his naive declaration of being a hero, something way beyond his methods of reaching, but in the eyes of the kid sitting right next to him, was the greatest hero ever, just by being himself.